Think about the music topping the charts right now. Most of it is built by algorithms, polished by ghostwriters, and locked perfectly onto a digital grid with endless pitch correction. A sterile, predictable science. But exactly 50 years ago, in the bicentennial year of 1976, the American FM airwaves sounded radically different. The music was forged in analog sweat. You could hear the tape hiss. You could feel the hot vacuum tubes in the amplifiers pushing air into the room. It was deeply, beautifully human. And here is what most people don't realize about the records that defined that year. The real shock isn't just that these songs sound infinitely better today. It's that many of them were considered catastrophic financial risks at the time. Studio executives begged to shelve them. Veteran producers predicted absolute failure. Yet half a century later, while today's viral hits fade in a fortnight, these 10 rock testaments continue to dominate. They silence modern producers who cannot replicate their raw power, even with infinite digital tracks at their disposal. Some songs become hits, others become something else entirely. 10. The Boys Are Back in Town by Thin Lizzy. It happens more often than you'd think in the music business. The biggest hit of a band's career is often the one they almost threw away. During the grueling jailbreak sessions at Ramport Studios in London, Phil Lynott was deeply unsatisfied with a particular track they were tracking. He listened to the playback and felt it was entirely too acoustic, too gentle. He actually looked around the control room and called it wimpy. The band was fully prepared to leave it off the record and move on to heavier material, but their co-manager caught a rough demo tape. He heard that central melodic chorus, and he refused to let it die. He pushed the band to take the arrangement back into the live room and give it a much harder electric treatment. That decision changed everything. Guitarists Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson developed a stunning dual lead harmony technique for the melody.
Spread the word around.
They split the signal in an intricately panned stereo mix, sending one guitar hard left and the other hard right. It is a sonic layout that still gives modern audio engineers headaches, trying to balance perfectly. That aggressive twin guitar attack didn't just save the song from the scrap heap. It laid the heavy foundation for an entire generation of British metal that would follow in its wake.
And if the boys wanna fight, you better let them.
Sometimes the song you write by accident is the one that defines your legacy. 9. Detroit Rock City by Kiss. There are moments when a working band shifts from just a musical act to a cultural force. And strangely enough, this particular track initially stumbled out of the gate. It completely failed to find an audience as a lead single. In fact, it wasn't until desperate radio DJs physically flipped the vinyl record over and started spinning the softer B-side that the album caught fire at all. But the A-side is what endured as the heavy, theatrical stadium anthem. Paul Stanley wrote it with a surprisingly dark origin. The lyrics were based on a real fan who tragically lost his life in a car crash on his way to see the band perform. To capture the weight of that tragedy, producer Bob Ezrin decided to build a massive soundscape at the record plant in New York. Long before digital samplers or computerized workstations existed, Ezrin used a highly complex tape splicing technique. Using actual razor blades and splicing tape, he meticulously blended real Foley sound effects of a car sequence and news broadcasts with the heavy studio instruments. He created a cinematic opening broadcast right there on the reel. It was gritty, it was dangerous, and it was completely over the top. That single production choice transformed the group from a dirty street act into theatrical arena rock gods. You don't just hear a song like this, you survive it. 8. Blitzkrieg Bop by Ramones. The loudest revolutions usually start with the simplest ideas. Here is what most people don't realize about the birth of global punk rock. The song that lit the match wasn't written to burn the establishment down. It was actually penned as an innocent, upbeat tribute to the bubblegum pop group, the Bay City Rollers. Tommy Ramone crafted the core melody, aiming for a pure, infectious pop feel. He just wanted a catchy chorus. Then bassist Dee Dee stepped in, shifted the tone, and gave it a slightly more aggressive title. They took their gear into Plaza Sound in New York City and tracked the entire album for roughly $6,400. Think about that for a second. That is a budget modern pop stars might spend on catering for a single afternoon. The resulting track is an exercise in absolute minimalism. There are absolutely no guitar solos, 0. The song relies entirely on Johnny Ramone's furious, downstroke-only Barry chords. He played them at an exhausting, relentless tempo that physically punished the hands. They didn't need studio polish. They didn't even need traditional musical technique. They just needed speed, volume, and utter conviction. It single-handedly stripped rock back to its primal, beating core. It proved forever that sheer attitude could outmuscle technical perfection any day of the week. A perfectly played note means nothing if it doesn't have a pulse. But while some artists were stripping the music down to its bare, aggressive pulse, others were finding entirely new ways to weave acoustics and electricity together. 7. Crazy on You by Heart. Take the furious acoustic introduction that kicks off this next track. It was recorded in a single take by a guitarist who had never actually played it live before. Inside Mushroom Studios in Vancouver, Nancy Wilson sat on the floor, absolutely terrified of the recording process. Her sister, Anne, had penned the lyrics in a haze of anxiety, processing the lingering shadow of the Vietnam War and a turbulent romance. Nancy channeled all that tension into a frenetic acoustic opening known as Silver Wheels. She blended a highly complex fingerpicking technique with aggressive flamenco strumming. If you try to run that performance through modern digital quantization today, the grid completely destroys the natural swing of her hands. It is raw, rushing, and human, and when the full band kicks in, it shattered the industry's glass ceiling overnight. It proved once and for all that a female-fronted band could hit the tape just as hard and heavy as Led Zeppelin. Sometimes the most powerful noise comes from the quietest fear. 6. Show Me the Way by Peter Frampton.
Show me the way.
Speaking of the raw energy of a live performance, this next track proves that the studio isn't always where the song finds its soul. The original 1975 studio version of this track was a complete commercial dud. It fell completely flat.
But all I really wanna know.
The label executives were absolutely terrified when the artist suggested releasing a live concert recording as the lead single for the next record. They thought it was guaranteed career suicide to push a live cut to radio. But the recordings captured at the Long Beach Arena and the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco had something the studio tapes lacked: a spontaneous, undeniable connection with the crowd.
I want you.
And that's where everything changes. Peter Frampton utilized a device called the Heil Talk Box.
Someone thought of healing.
He routed his electric guitar signal mechanically through a literal plastic tube held in his mouth. allowing his vocal cords to physically shape the guitar's tone. It was a completely analog mechanical precursor to modern auto-tune, and it transfixed the crowds. The massive success of that single propelled the record to become one of the best-selling live albums in music history. A song doesn't truly exist until an audience breathes life into it. 5. 2112 Aperture by Rush. But what if your label doesn't want you to play to the crowd at all? What if they demand you write a standard 3-minute pop hit because your last album flopped? Mercury Records gave exactly that ultimatum. In response, Neil Peart, Geddy Lee, and Alex Lifeson locked themselves inside Toronto's Massey Hall studios and committed a deliberate act of defiance. Instead of a radio-friendly tune, they recorded a massive 20-minute conceptual sci-fi suite about a dystopian future. They packed the arrangement with jarring, odd-time signature shifts. We are talking 7/8 and 5/4 timing, executed with a mechanical precision that modern drummers still struggle to replicate without the crutch of a digital click track. It was an astonishing display of technical rebellion, and it worked. It worked too well. The sprawling composition didn't alienate their fans. It galvanized them. It established progressive rock as a formidable commercial force in North America, and earned the trio lifelong creative control over their own catalog. True artistic freedom usually requires burning the bridge back to safety. 4. Fly Like an Eagle by Steve Miller Band.
Lord to the revolution.
Sometimes, however, the defiance isn't directed at the label. Sometimes, an artist has to dismantle their own work to find the brilliant core hidden inside. Here is the strange part about this smooth, spacey rock hit. It actually started its life 3 years earlier as a heavy, grinding blues track. Steve Miller had been playing a faster, much rougher version of the song on the road since 1973, but it never quite clicked. He couldn't find the pocket. He finally cracked the code at CBS Studios in San Francisco by doing something deeply counterintuitive. He drastically slowed the tempo down. He let the groove breathe.
What about the children, yo?
Then he introduced the Roland SH 2000 synthesizer.
To the sea, Lord.
Miller used the early electronic instrument to create ethereal wind textures and sweeping space sound effects. He was pioneering the integration of synthetic, electronic tones into the middle of mainstream guitar rock.
Lord to the revolution.
It was a massive sonic leap. It successfully bridged the gritty gap between classic blues rock and the incoming wave of synthesizer-driven pop that would dominate the next decade. Progress requires the courage to tear apart yesterday's good idea. While some bands were integrating new technology to expand their sound, others used the studio to make heavy, terrifying topics startlingly beautiful. 3. Don't Fear, The Reaper by Blue Oyster Cult.
Baby, take my hand.
This eerie meditation on eternal love and what lies beyond death is entirely rooted in a very real, very human anxiety. Guitarist Buck Dharma wrote the core of the song as a personal coping mechanism after receiving a sobering diagnosis of an irregular heartbeat. He was facing his own mortality. But when he brought the concept to the record plant in New York, the band's producer, Sandy Pearlman, absolutely hated it. Pearlman felt it completely lacked the heavy metal aggression the group was known for, because the regular lead singer couldn't quite capture the fragile, haunting tone the song demanded. Dharma ended up singing the lead vocals himself. He delivered a quiet, almost whispering performance that sits in stark contrast to the heavy instrumentation. And then there is the infamous percussion. Co-producer David Lucas played a persistent cowbell pattern throughout the track. To make it work without sounding comical, the engineers applied heavy tape compression that allowed the sharp, metallic strike to pierce directly through the dense, multi-tracked guitar layers without overpowering them. It remains one of the most chilling, perfectly produced rock tracks of the decade, proving heavy bands could achieve pure pop perfection without losing their edge. Confronting your deepest fear often produces your greatest work. 2. Carry On Wayward Son by Kansas. But sometimes the greatest work is born out of sheer, unadulterated panic. The song that single-handedly saved this band from being dropped by their label was written on the absolute last day of recording. Music executive Don Kirshner was ready to cut their funding entirely. The band lacked a hit, the budget was exhausted, and their career was effectively over. Kerry Livgren wrote this massive track at the 11th hour.
Once I rose above the noise and confusion.
He literally brought the sheet music to his bandmates while they were packing up their gear in the middle of studio in the country in Bogalusa, Louisiana. They had to unpack, set back up, and learn it on the spot. And what they recorded was an absolute beast of an arrangement. It features highly complex, a cappella vocal harmonies, layered directly over a shifting, aggressive guitar riff. Tracking those massive vocals and shifting time signatures using only 24-track analog tape was a massive engineering challenge. There was no room for error. You had to sing it right. You had to play it right. And they did. It became the definitive American progressive rock anthem, fusing classical music complexity with absolute arena rock power. Sometimes the edge of the cliff is the only place you can learn to fly. 1. More Than a Feeling by Boston. If you want to talk about pristine, flawless rock production, all roads lead to this specific track. But here is what most people don't realize. The most massive sounding rock song of the decade wasn't recorded in $1 million studio in Los Angeles or London. It was recorded in a basement in Massachusetts by an MIT engineer. Tom Scholz spent 5 years obsessively crafting this track in his home studio. He funded the equipment by working a day job at the Polaroid Corporation. He wasn't just a musician, he was a sonic architect. When Epic Records finally signed the band, the major label executives forced them to fly to Los Angeles. The mandate was to re-record the entire album in a proper professional facility. But Scholz knew his home recordings sounded better. So, he committed the ultimate act of industry deception. He went to LA, went through the motions, but secretly used his original basement tapes for the final mix. What he achieved down in that basement is still studied by audio engineers today. Scholz invented his own custom guitar pedals to get the exact tone he heard in his head. He layered up to 32 separate tracks of acoustic and electric guitars, meticulously bouncing them down to a single stereo track without losing an ounce of fidelity. On analog tape, bouncing tracks usually creates massive amounts of hiss and mud. Doing it cleanly was considered an impossible feat of engineering. The result established the platinum standard for FM rock radio sound design. It permanently elevated the sonic expectations of rock music, proving that absolute perfection doesn't come from money. It comes from an obsession that simply refuses to compromise. These 10 tracks from 1976 did far more than just top the charts. They challenged the physical limits of analog tape. They tested the boundaries of raw talent, and they laid bare the reality of human emotion. Today, disposable pop is engineered in boardrooms to catch a fleeting trend before vanishing into the algorithm. But these recordings were forged in sweat, financial risk, and absolute defiance. They survive half a century later, cutting through the static of the modern era to remind us of the enduring power of true musicianship. We don't just listen to these songs to remember who we were. We listen to them to remember what music is supposed to feel like.